Hello, I'm here to allow you to explore women in the 19th century, the mistreatment that they suffered, their fight for equality, the different social classes, and much more. I hope that you're able to learn a lot about women in the 19th century by watching my video. Thank you and enjoy. So women in the 19th century, their main purpose was to marry and reproduce. So once they were married, they really didn't have a life of their own. They were completely controlled by their husbands. For the most part, once they had children, they continued to have children, like an abundant amount of children. And so instead of them going out to work, they were to stay in the house, take care of the kids, take care of the house duties, so that whenever the husband returned, that he would come home to a nice good meal, the house would be clean. All of that was expected of her. Also, whenever she married, she had no legal status. She could not buy property or build property without the consent of her husband. She also had no full claim for her children. So if her husband wanted to take the children and just leave her behind, the wife, he can do so. During the time, there was a newspaper known as the Illustrated Police News. This newspaper discussed various social issues at the time, and one of the issues that came up was, "Is marriage a failure?" That was the headline. Underneath was a picture, this picture, which shows the various downfalls within the marriage during this time. In the middle, there's a man and a woman faced back to back with a space in between them, and in between the space are the words "divorce." And underneath the couple, you see a child who's down with his head down, who looks sad. So you can imagine how depressing that the relationship was between the two. At the bottom right of the picture, there's also the man literally stomping on the wife. And so that can exhibit how abusive the relationship can become sometimes, whenever the wife wasn't able to carry out the household duties, or if they just didn't have a good relationship. So this is another way for me to stress the idea of how bad the relationship was between the two. Now, it wasn't always like this, but this is just the general idea of what the relationship was. Okay, let's talk about the social classes. The first social class was the upper class, which consisted of Queen Victoria, of course, because she was the queen. She's over everything. The people who worked with her, not the gardeners, but the people who actually helped her make huge decisions. Aristocrats were also up there, and there's also people that stayed in places known as the lawn and the uplands. These were two housing areas for very wealthy people, which also consisted mostly of women. Some were widow women who had lost their husbands, of course, because they're widows. They had their children with them, which were mostly girls for the most part, but not all the time. They had the housekeepers, which were mostly females. So most of the housing consisted of females. So the uplands and the lawns was a well-known area where just wealthy women stayed. And then we go on to the middle class, which consisted of attorneys, physicians, writers, engineers, and members of the clergy, people who participated in church. And then we have the lower class, which is also known as the ambiguous class, because some people consider it partially part of the middle class, but for the most part it's lower, because they're not exactly the same, but that's why we call it ambiguous, because it's a little bit of both. And so this consisted of housekeepers, governesses, washerwomen, that's people who deal with laundry. And there's many more jobs. Some women worked in the mines, some people made clothing, and others may have probably worked on the side of the street selling things that they had made by themselves, like jewelry and all those other things. And then we have the underclass. This class consisted of the unemployed, prostitutes, and then people who have been taken into jail who are now unable to find a job. And for the most part, this would be the mentally ill or people who have just simply done a crime. So that's a glance of the social classes during the time. The women's suffrage movement was a prominent event that occurred during the Victorian era. This movement consisted of the women having various protests and taking action for their right to vote and hold office. In 1898, Emmeline Pankhurst started an organization known as the Women's Social and Political Union. This union would have various protests, protesting and arguing that they wanted their right to vote and their right to hold office, which is the whole point of the Women's Suffrage Act. They became very unpopular as they grew as an organization, because not only were they going against what the men wanted, because the men felt like they were the only ones who needed to vote. They thought that women should stay in their place and that they were superior to the women, that the women just didn't need any say. Bigger component of their dislike was their violence. They would go around smashing the windows of governmental buildings, and they would also assault police officers. And then they became more violent whenever Emmeline Pankhurst died and her daughter took over. When her daughter took over, her daughter liked the idea of arson, so she would go around setting buildings on fire. And so various supporters, various women in this group were often arrested. So eventually the idea of women's suffrage died down until after World War I. This is whenever women were eventually given the right to vote, because the government said, okay, the women were a great help to our men while they were fighting, and also they had women who fought too. So our women were a great contribution to the war. So we're going to give them the right to vote. Also, women wanted rights within their marriage. They wanted the right to have their own property. They wanted the right to have their own money that they have inherited from their past family members. Because once they married, their husband takes over all their money. They wanted child custody acts. Eventually, after various protests, they did gain their right to have these things for themselves personally. So they did get child custody. They did get the right to own their own land and property, or to keep their own money instead of giving it all to their husband. So thank you for watching my video, and I hope that it educated you a little bit and allowed you to learn more about women in the 19th century in England. Now you know about the social classes and how the women were treated in their marriages, how they fought for their rights, and eventually through protest and either violently or peacefully protesting, they were able to get what they wanted. And so I hope that this was a little snippet of information that allowed you to be able to use it.